So I feel that an introduction for Salman Rushdie is almost unnecessary. Nonetheless, here we go. We're delighted to welcome Salman Rushdie to discuss his 12th novel, 2 years, 8 months, and 28 days.
Nights.
Excellent start. Anyway, it's now been 26 years, 7 months, and 28 days or nights since the fatwa against Rushdie was announced, and 17 years and 14 days since the government of Iran announced a public commitment that it would neither support nor hinder assassination operations. However, it's only one of the many stories that make up the life of Salman Rushdie. He was born in Bombay and educated there and at Rugby School in Warwickshire before reading history at Cambridge. Before turning to literature full-time, he worked as a copywriter for Ogilvy, and while there, he wrote a small book, some of you may have heard of, called Midnight's Children. This went on to win the 1981 Booker Prize for Fiction, the Booker of Bookers for the best novels among the Booker Prize winners for fiction at its 25th anniversary, and finally the best of the Bookers, awarded to commemorate the prize's 40th anniversary. He's completed 12 novels, 2 children's books and a memoir, along with 3 edited collections and other essays and works of nonfiction. He's an emblem of and strong proponent, shouting for human rights and freedom of speech. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, Commandeur de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres, and in 2007 was knighted for his services to literature. So again, please welcome Salman Rushdie. So we're here to talk about your new book, 2 years, 8 months, and 28 nights.
Which is 1001. I know you're a very mathematical audience. But as the internet already tells me, it doesn't work if there's a leap year. To which all I can say is, there's no leap year.
So in a recent interview in Canada, where I'm from, you said in reference to the tales of the 1001 Nights and other myths that realism showed up later in your life and seemed inferior. So it would be great if you could start by telling us a little bit about the jinn in this particular novel. What brought you to the jinn and their stories as a way of grounding a much larger cultural narrative or battle?
Well, I mean, if you grow up in India, you grow up with the jinn. They're everywhere. And people still use them colloquially. Like if your car has a flat tire, you say that a jinn did it. If you knock over a glass of wine, it's always somebody else's fault, and it may as well be a supernatural creature. So these stories are things that you grow up with, and the jinn. I mean, they're quite mischievous. So they on a scale, they range from ordinary mischief to something much more malevolent. And so I'd sort of had them in the back of my head, and when I found myself wanting to write a novel about a world in which things were going badly wrong in many ways, it seemed like that these creatures whose job it was to make things go very badly wrong seemed like an obvious metaphor to reach for.
Yeah. But as creatures, they also, Dunya, the princess of the jinn.
Yeah, there are. I'm assuming that there are nice ones, but I basically made them up. And yes, I suppose the main female character of the novel is a princess of the jinn who is, unlike the others, somebody who is actually very fond of human beings in general and one in particular.
Yeah.
And she, when her less pleasant fellow jinn attacked the earth, she's the one who comes to the defense.
Oh, and she comes out swinging. It's not just a little bit of a defense.
Yeah. No, she's a badass creature.
And she, so in the novel, she rallies her descendants.
Yes, because she's been here. At the point, the story suggests that hundreds of years ago, in the 12th century, she visited the earth and had a love affair with a Arab philosopher and produced supernatural numbers of children, which gradually over the centuries, coming down to the present day, had spread across the world. And when there's this assault on the earth by the dark jinn, she comes back and sort of, as it were, reactivates her descendants, who in some way are partly jinn as well, in order to fight back. So it's a sort of War of the World story, I guess.
And so one of the things I found very interesting was the supernatural epic battle that takes place at the climax. And on the one hand, we seem to have reason, and on the other, faith or religion. Do you think there's any way of finding a common ground between those two, or are we destined to fight? Is there a synthesis, or just a battle?
You're asking me? I think no.
Yeah. But then what do we do in response?
Excuse me?
What do we do if there's...
Oh, I think, we can just start understanding that the real fairy tale is God.
Yeah.
And get rid of it. I'm very much of the Christopher Hitchens persuasion in this matter, who was one of my close friends, and so we agree about the fact that religion has become a very big problem in the world, and it's very strange because when I was young, like in the mid-60s, when I was at college, nobody ever talked about religion. Religion just sort of disappeared. The idea that it would return to become a colossal force in the world would have seemed absurd 50 years ago. And yet there it is, sitting in the middle of the room. And so even though I'm not at all a religious person, I find myself writing about it quite a lot. Because it seems to me there's no way of not writing about it because it becomes such an important subject. So I would really like never to write about it again. That would be my preference. In fact, I've kind of promised myself that the next book will have no mention of religion in it. But I've been saying this to myself for a long time, and I keep failing. So there we are.
So is it religion as a grand narrative that draws you back?
No, it's just because of its public function these days. I think, because my view is that the private practice of religion is, my view, is not my business. It's like if there are people who find it valuable to them, nourishing, consoling, whatever, that's just not my business. That's their business. It's only when it becomes a public force, when it starts telling other people how to behave, or trying to, then I think it becomes everyone's business. And that's sort of what's happened, isn't it?
One of the things we like to do is...
By the way, just to say that the point about the jinn, one of the things I really like about them is that they're they do exist in the Islamic tradition, but they're actually pre-Islamic. They're actually ancient pagan creatures. And one of the things I like about them is that quite a lot of them don't necessarily believe in God either. So to them, God is just as weird an idea as the jinn are to us.
Yeah.
And that made them appealing to me.
And we certainly see that in the epic clash between the two sides. That you have, on the one hand, you have Dunya, who's fighting for humanity and trying to save humanity, which he successfully does. But on the other, they say, oh well, if that's what you'd like us to do.
Yeah, the problem with the jinn is that one of them in the novel gets kind of infected with religion, but most of them just want to cause trouble and take over, and they're actually not very good at it, because the thing about the jinn is that they're very bad at focusing.
Yep.
They have sort of form of ADD. I think they get bored easily, they get distracted. So even when they're trying to conquer the world, they decide, well, maybe not today.
Yeah, or there's a scene where the sea creature emerges.
Yes,
the Staten Island ferry.
They have these metamorphic abilities, so they can turn themselves into all kinds of things. And yeah, one of them turns into a sea monster and eats the Staten Island ferry. I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, but then he has a nap, right? Then he has a nap.
Then he has a nap. Exactly.
That takes a couple of months. So it's quite interesting to see, even in the midst of this battle.
Yeah, they're lazy. The jinn are very lazy, which is useful because it makes them defeatable.
And one of the things, they're fantastic creatures, so one of the things we learn in the novel is that stories are a curse and the antidote at the same time, nested inside each other. This is the climax of the book, and I found this incredible, that we can't pull them apart. We can't see where they start, see where they end. They're nested together. So what do you think the place for stories is?
Well, you see, the reason for that, there is, first of all, there is in the tradition, like in books like The 1001 Nights, those books are very fond of the idea of the nested stories, the Chinese box stories. A story in which somebody says, that reminds me of a story, and tells you a story in which somebody says there's a story about that, and so on. You know, so that's there in the literature. But it struck me that in many ways, that is, and many of those stories don't finish. You know, they get interrupted, and it seemed to me in many ways that's quite a true portrait of how we live. That we all live in we are ourselves an unfinished story. You know, because here we are being the story of ourselves. And surrounding us are like concentric circles of continuing stories. You know, so there's let's say, a story of our family and friends, you know, around us, and around that there's a larger story of a community, and maybe the story of a city or the story of a country, or you know, etc. So we are there in the middle of these concentric circles of stories, and they're not ended. You know, they're continuing. So we all live in these unfinished stories. You know, and so I thought that was just a useful way of talking about what life is like.
And I love the metaphor. An Indigenous writer I have read for my own research in the past talks about these stories of or concentric circles of stories, but they intersect as well, right?
And they intersect as well. They infect each other. A wonderful example of this is, I don't know how many of you have seen, there's a wonderful film by Pedro Almodovar called Talk to Her. And in that film, he does this, where somebody starts telling a story, and the film goes into that story, and in that story there's another story, and it goes down about 5 levels, you know, and then they all end one after the other, boom, 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 like that, you know, and it's an amazing effect. He does it with such skill that you're never confused. You know exactly where you are. But it's a very appealing thing, and I had great. I mean, there's a chapter in the book where the stories start diving into other stories, and it was one of the more difficult chapters to write, because you want the reader to still have a sense of a through line. You know, there's a reason why you're doing it. But it was also kind of one of the most fun chapters to write.
Yeah, I very much enjoyed it. Before we open it up to the audience, we have a few crowdsourced questions. And a lot of them, not surprisingly, were about religion. So what can be done to ensure religion is not being taken literally? And do you believe our own political...
What can I do? That religion is not what?
Being taken literally.
Oh, yeah.
And do you believe our own political correctness prevents us from tackling the problem head on?
Well, what can be done is to... I mean, I think the two parts of the question are related, because it seems to me the way you confront ideas that you don't like is to confront them and argue about them. And there has grown up a conventional wisdom that somehow religion should be excused from that kind of criticism. And frankly, I don't see why. I mean, it seems to me that it's one idea amongst many ideas. And one of the kind of essential part of the nature of intellectual life is to question all ideas, you know, to submit them to a rigorous interrogation, you know, particularly when you begin to see that they're capable of giving rise to very unpleasant effects, you know. So yeah, I do think there is a problem of PC where people are, and I don't think it's only political correctness, I think it's also fear, because there have been a number of, as you know, violent attacks on people who have been critical of religion. That, again, makes people worried about doing it, but I think it's very important to do it.
And it also ignores centuries of religious philosophical tradition, right? We have centuries of arguing about religion.
Exactly.
Good constructive ways.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, there's one thing about, there's two ways of arguing about religion. One is from inside and the other is from outside. So, of course, you know, all religions have theological disputes, you know, and evolve in a way through that. But it's also important to be able to come at the subject from outside, you know, so that you don't have to be bound by the rules of the religion, because I think one of the problems of the interior argument is that you can't really question first principles. You know, you can't question the existence of God. You can't question the nature of revelation. And it seems to me that if you're going to really talk about religion, you have to question both those things.
Yes.
You know, so, but I think both forms of discourse have their place. Yes.
Yeah. Another related question, which I'll touch on because I quite liked it. but I think you might have answered most of it. A new term has been coined recently, regressive leftists, to identify a trend where illiberal theocratic ideologies are being defended by people through conflating valid criticism of an ideology with bigotry towards individuals.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on the way that...
Well, I hadn't heard the term, but I kind of like it.
Yeah.
You know? I do think it has... I mean, I found myself saying this to somebody the other day, that what other ideology that was aggressively anti-woman, homophobic, and anti-Semitic would the British left support? You know, and the answer is probably none. But for some reason, when it's a religion, all that gets brushed aside. You know, and I think that's a really very big problem.
Yeah. Great. Last one from me. It's one of my favorite passages in the novel. It's where the American president... I love how you've brought pop culture and Donald Trump's...
yeah, I'm very proud
here.
I'm very
It's
proud
wonderful.
of having invented Donald Trump before he invented himself.
So I do wonder, though, about the timing of that, right? So there's a wonderful, very subtle aside to Trump. And I think, oh gosh, did you actually realize what...
No, I mean, you know, the point
Incredible.
is,
Incredible.
if you happen to have an egomaniac in town, you know, he's going to do something to draw attention to himself. I didn't realize he was going to do this, but...
Well, beautifully prescient in the context of the book.
I have this terrible confession to make, which is I've only met Donald Trump like twice. But for some reason, he took a shine to me. And this is really embarrassing. and I think it's because this will show you how old we both are, but there's once upon a time I found myself sitting next to him and his children at a Crosby, Stills and Nash concert in New York, and he knew all the words to all the songs.
Oh my word.
And I thought, oh my God, Donald Trump singing along with Crosby, Stills and Nash, that was weird. But somehow I think it became, I'm sorry to say, a bonding experience for us. And so now, I mean, I have to say, I only met him twice since then. But on one occasion we were, I don't know, at some theatre together, and he's never quiet, Donald Trump. So he came at me from a distance like this, and he would shout, "Salman!
Oh my word.
You're the man!" I go, really?
So will this be part of his campaign?
So the correct response, of course, is no, Donald, you're the man.
Oh my.
And then he offered me, it was at the time of the US Tennis Open, and he said, you come and use my box whenever you want it. And I thought, that's a kind of real career-ending move, to be seen in Donald Trump's box at the US Open. The end,
Oh my.
On the other hand, it's a really good box, But I didn't go.
Are you a tennis fan?
Yeah.
Well then, I don't
No.
know. Principles are important.
No. I mean, there are other places to sit, which also have a good view. But yeah, anyway, so that's my shameful confession. My pal Donald.
It gets even better. So you talk about Donald Trump. You also talk about Barack Obama, and you have him trying to respond.
It's not really Barack Obama. I mean, it's a president with big ears.
Whose wife dances better than he does.
But his wife dances better than he does. That's true. But his race is not specified, and the actual exact time of the novel is a little vague.
Yes, that's true.
So it may or may not be Barack Obama.
So the president, who may or may not be Barack Obama, has to respond to all of these strange things going on in this war between the worlds. And there's an apocalyptic storm, and lightning strikes, and the ground is shifting, and people are floating, and there's a baby that senses corruption and causes horrible disfigurement. And he comes up with this incredibly banal response, right? Which is, we'll continue to do everything in our power to combat this. And we think, well, mate, there's nothing you can do at all. This is crazy. This is so far removed from anything you can do. So the question then is really, how do we combat that which doesn't bend to reason or rationality?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the fortunate thing about being a novelist is you get to ask the question. You don't have to have the answer. I mean, you combat it by combating it. You know, I mean, that's not, there isn't a kind of magic button. You know, but one of the things that the book really what the book suggests is that the resistance comes from ordinary people. You know, because what happens in the novel is that these ordinary people who discover that they're the descendants long ago of the Jinn princess, and so that it suggests they have a little bit of magic in them. You know, so. But what that really means, what I'm really meaning to say by that, is that people faced with an extreme situation very often discover in themselves resources, courage, abilities, which they didn't know they possessed, you know, and are actually able to rise to the occasion, you know, and defend themselves and stand up for themselves, you know. And I think that's essentially what happens in the book. Yes, there are these jinn flying around, you know, but essentially what happens is the resistance to chaos, mayhem, evil, etc., is ordinary people discovering in themselves the capacity to resist, and really that's what the book's about. Yeah.
Fabulous. And with that, shall we open it up
to
questions from the floor? There's a microphone in the center. Yes, so if we could please, I'm sure in this packed room, we've got some excellent questions.
Or we'll just sit here.
I could keep talking, but, oh, there we go.
Thanks. Yeah.
It's like a very basic question, which is why has there been such a rise in religiosity? I mean, I can remember going to Pakistan many years ago, and the Pakistan cricket team would kind of look pretty much like everyone else. And now people are bearded and say "Inshallah" all the time. What has happened that has caused this? I agree with you. I think growing up in the '60s, I would never have predicted this outcome.
None of us. It's unfortunately, while we were all busy, you know, inhaling, unlike President Clinton, you know, I mean, basically the uncool people took over the world. So, you know, beware. This could happen to you. I don't know. I think the problem with the question is it's a very important question, and the answer is not at all short. But because I think what happened is different things in different places. You know, I think what happened in Iran was a response to the rule of the Shah. You know, and what happened in Algeria was a response to the gradual corruption of the party of the revolution, which had been a secular party, and so on. You know, so. But what I think one of the things I could say in general is precisely related to what this book talks about, which is that we live in a time of incredibly metamorphic, rapid transformation, change everywhere. You know, the world is changing at a speed faster than it's ever done before, and some of that, you know, is your fault. But I think for some people, or even for many people, in a time of such change, it engenders great uncertainty and even fear. And it becomes comforting to reach for something which feels unchanging, something which says this is an eternal truth. And you can hold on to this and cling on to this in the middle of this time of great change. You know, and I think that's one of the things which for some people is an attraction, that religion becomes an attraction, because it seems to offer a moral code and an unchanging world in the middle of a world that is changing very fast. You know? So that's one thing. The violent thing is another thing. You know, I mean, that's another conversation, perhaps.
Great. Next question.
All right. Hello, Salman. Thank you for being here and for being you. I really appreciate someone stepping up like this.
Thank you.
My question is, you said people can think in their own homes what they want, and at the risk of trying to combat thought crime, you know, I wonder if that's the right attitude, because religions are so inherently damaging. Like, okay, it's fine to at your home believe the Christian mythology or the Muslim mythology, but to do that, you have to accept a certain set of tenets that are very worrying, because, yeah, like you said, being scared of gay people and those kinds of things. And if you, like in Holland, for example, we have Christian parties. And if they were to come to power as an absolute power, I'm worried that they will have to follow what it says in the Bible, and suddenly all those people that are silent, might have to own up to that belief.
Well, look, it's a well-asked question, because private life is not necessarily only private. Private life can lead to public action, and to the kinds of prejudice and bigotry that you touched on. I suppose what I was trying to say is that the moment it becomes any form of a public action, which can include a prejudice against a gay person, for example, then it becomes a real difficulty, and we have to talk about it. I'm just saying that there are people who are not fanatics, who are not bigots, who are religious. I mean, we live in the country of the Church of England. It's the only religion ever started for a divorce. It's a relatively mild form of a religion, which in other forms can be quite virulent, such as in America nowadays, where there are very virulent forms of Christianity. I'm just saying that the private desire to find a form of consolation, I might think it's wrong, I might think it's absurd, but in the end, it's not my business to tell you what you should believe or not believe. But the moment that belief starts manifesting itself in society in ways that become problematic, then of course it is my business and your business, everyone else's. So I'm just trying to make a distinction, but I agree it's a difficult distinction to make between private life and public life. And actually it's one of the things that I kind of would argue with Christopher Hitchens about, because he would take your position, which is all of it is awful, and you can't make these hair-splitting distinctions, and I'm tempted by that position. I'm just trying to be nice.
I also, I have to wonder, certain aspects of religion seem good, right? Charity, for example.
Yeah, certain aspects of religion seem good, but you can be charitable without being religious.
Very true.
I mean, you can be good without being religious. I think it's one of the things that I find most problematic about the way in which religious people talk, is that there's an assumption that you can't have an ethical sense if you don't have a religious structure, you don't have some kind of supreme arbiter, and so on. And it seems to me quite clear that the opposite is true, that human beings in some sense have an ethical sense, and one of the ways in which historically we've given expression to that ethical sense is to create religions which codify a form of ethics. It seems to me that religions exist historically to answer two great questions. One is, how did we get here? Where do we come from? And the other is, now that we're here, how shall we live? So the question of origins, the question of ethics. It seems to me those are the big questions. And my view is we know a lot more now than we knew when the Bible was written. And one of the things we know is that, at least in my view, I don't need to look at religion for an answer to the question of origins. It seems to me there are a lot more interesting and knowledgeable answers than that available now. And I don't want to look at religion for an answer to the question of ethics, because on the whole, religion has not been particularly great on that subject of late. And so my requirement for religion doesn't exist, because I don't need it to answer these great questions of life. And I think it's perfectly possible to argue that our ethical sense precedes our development of religions, and that we are in some way hardwired to have an ethic. I think people do instinctively have a need to distinguish right from wrong, and good action from bad action, and religion is just one of the codes by which they try to explain that.
Fabulous. Next question, please.
Hi, Jonathan Matalon.
Hi.
Thank you very much for taking the time to come here and speak to us. I see a lot of value in religion, and from all of the things you've mentioned already, providing some truth in an ever-changing world, fighting against capitalism. But I don't want to ask about capitalism. I want to ask about the concerning effects of religion as we see them today. If you follow the Middle East or Europe or as a matter of fact, unfortunately, almost anywhere, you can see those bad circumstances. And I would like to ask you if you're optimist, and if you are, why? And if you're pessimist, why?
Well, it's very difficult to look at the world right now and not have a tragic sense of life, you know, if you're a writer. However, this book is strangely optimistic, you will discover, as you go through it. It's perhaps more optimistic than the times deserve, you know. But what I think is, quite seriously, that you know, I was a student of history. That was my university subject. So, and one of the things you learn in the study of history is the unpredictability of history. You know, the idea that history inevitably goes in a certain direction is just not true. That history is very, very changeable and unpredictable, and it constantly takes one by surprise. You know, just to give you one recent example, if I had been sitting here in January of 1989, and I had said to you, the Soviet Union will not exist at Christmas time, you would have thought I was crazy, you know, because it seemed to be this huge, solid, powerful entity that was just there, you know. The idea that it would just blow away like dust, you know, was very hard to imagine, and yet that's what happened. When, of course, now there's somebody trying to put it back together. But that's a different story. I'm just saying that it's an example of how unexpectedly and rapidly things can shift, you know. And so I think if one wants to be, I mean, they can shift for the worse as well, by the way, not just for the better. But what I think is that the future is invariably unexpected. It's not what we think it's going to be. It could be worse than we think it's going to be, or it could be better, but it's going to be different, you know. And so I think that's a kind of comfort, you know, the mutability of the future, you know. And I think nowadays there's so many people whose job appears to be to try and predict the future, you know. Kind of futurology has become this big thing. And it always strikes me that futurology is the science of being wrong about the future. You know? Because that's, I mean, just look at the way in which the future has been described in movies quite recently. You know, the future according to 2001: A Space Odyssey. You know, in that future, we're all wearing Pierre Cardin jumpsuits, you know, and actually space exploration is really much more advanced than it is. And as it happens, we're not wearing Pierre Cardin jumpsuits. We can't see anywhere. But, and we haven't really got as far as the movie suggests we might have got, you know, in terms of leaving the planet. So every time anybody tries to predict the future, it never works. It actually tells you about that time, you know. I mean, the reason why George Orwell called 1984 is because it was written in 1948. He just flipped the last two digits, you know. But the 1984 that he wrote about is much more a portrait of fears that were present in 1948. You know, it tells us a lot about the time in which the book was written, you know. And I think that's when people project into the future in works of art, whether movies or books, or they're actually talking about their own concerns, you know. And there's actually one of the things about this book, which somebody actually explicitly says in the book, that, you know, if you're talking about the future, you're talking about the present. You know, if you're talking about the past, you're talking about the present. You know, and because we are here now, and we have our concerns now. And we find those concerns either in the past or in the future. You know, that's how we think. So if you look at, for instance, histories, if you take the 16th century, I mean, the kind of, since Hilary Mantel's so much popularized the 16th century of late, but if you look at the way in which the 16th century was written about in the 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th century, and the 20th century, they could be writing about different times entirely, because each age finds in the past the things that concern it in its present, you know, and the same is true of the future. So I think to answer your question about optimism, all I can say is it won't be what you think. It might be worse, it might be better, but it won't be what you think. The day after tomorrow, I mean.
That's quite a solid scientific outcome.
Huh?
It's a solid scientific outcome. We know what it will not be.
We know what it will not be. Exactly. That's very good. Yeah, exactly. What you think it's going to be is what it won't be.
Fabulous. Next question, please.
Hi there. It's been almost 30 years since you received what can only be described as a very bad book review from the Ayatollah.
It was described as that
Yeah.
by V.S. Naipaul.
Oh, really?
Yes, it was.
So I was wondering, based on the Britain of today, do you think that your rough years that followed would be easier in the Britain of today or harder, given various shifts in public discourse, moral relativity?
No, I think it'd be much worse now. I mean, I think I was actually quite fortunate that what happened, and I would on the whole not recommend it, but I think that was just before, for example, the explosion of the information universe, and I think now, information moves so fast, and as we know, the internet is a very regrettably good tool for hostility. I mean, it's for many things, but including that. People can. There's all kinds of hysterias that seem to sweep across the internet, and I think the danger would have been much greater. That's what I'm saying, because I think it would have been possible to magnify the attack, 1,000-fold, 10,000-fold. I also just think the world's become even more violent than it was then. And if you like, the kind of privatization of violence, has made it more unpredictable when the violence will occur. I mean, at that time, the danger arose essentially from the Iranian state and its proxies, and essentially from nobody else. Although the Iranians did try and involve other people, but really nobody wanted to know about it, truthfully. Which also made it fixable, because you basically, there's one player, you can find ways to talk to that person and to nullify it, which is eventually what happened. Now, the threat is everywhere, and random, et cetera, and that's more alarming. So I think people are more afraid now than they were then. And it's a very much more worrying time for that reason.
Thank you.
Fabulous. Of course we do. We actually have time for quite a few more anyway.
Yeah, more.
Yeah.
More.
One of the things which I particularly enjoyed in this session actually is being exposed to sort of your critical thinking and the way you break down your problems and look at them. I have a 15-year-old son, and I'm very struck by the lack of the critical thinking that they get taught at school. It's very much, here's a bit of rote learning, go and learn this. And as a result, as a nation, we seem to be happier debating the offside rule than we are questions such as why am I here and how should I live?
Well, the offside rule is very important.
But what should we be promoting, and how can we get people to be having these important discussions?
Well, I mean, I think this is a question for the school curriculum. I mean, I think you're right that people are not really encouraged to think. I mean, it's interesting you raised the subject of critical thinking. I have an 18-year-old son who's just started at university, and he's very philosophically inclined, which means that he likes to argue a lot. and of course believes that he's always correct. So, and he told me, like yesterday on the phone, that they had been asked in this philosophy class, to come up with a definition of what a human being is. Not specific to a particular country or culture or whatever, but what is it that makes us human beings as opposed to not human beings? And somebody in the class had said that critical thinking was one of the things that defined us as human beings. And then, being 18 years old, he went on to argue that therefore, if you're in a coma, you probably no longer qualify as a human being because you can't indulge in critical thinking. Now, the person clearly didn't understand the flaw in that argument. And so my son rather proudly told me that he'd really taken him down because he pointed out that actually when we're asleep, we're not capable of critical thinking. And so do we cease to be human beings when we sleep? To which the other young fellow didn't have an answer, so my son wins. You know, but I think, you know, the point is, I think it's very helpful and valuable to young people to be asked to have that kind of conversation. You know, I mean, however unsophisticated the arguments might be, you know, you can only acquire sophisticated arguments by getting there. You know, by learning, and I certainly benefited, I think, in my education by having, you know, philosophy as a part of what I studied. You know, ideas, the history of ideas, you know, as something that I studied, and I think it would be really valuable if people were asked to study those things.
So why,
excuse me?
Why do you feel that other people don't seem to think it's important?
Well, because
is there a malaise in the sector?
Because there's an idea around at the moment, which is frankly not specific to any political party, so it's not a kind of left-right argument, that education is a training for a job. Yeah. You know, the kind of market-driven idea of education, that basically you're channeling people towards the workplace, you know, and that's what you're doing at school or at college. Whereas the old idea of the liberal arts education, the liberal education, was that you're actually training people to be human beings, you know, and allowing them to emerge from the educational system as complicated, interesting, rounded human beings who will then do something valuable in the world, you know, and I think that idea is under threat now, you know, and not just in England but everywhere, and I think it's a very valuable idea and it needs to be restated.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Next question.
Hello. I thought it was very interesting, just I studied history myself, what you were talking about, the unpredictability of history, and especially about how we are, in different centuries, we view and have different interpretations of history. What would you, in terms of the role of the novelist, how do you think that has changed, or has it actually stayed as almost that kind of stable source of truth or questioning? It'd be quite interesting to see your opinion on that. Well,
of course, you see, the problem with the moment anybody says something like the role of the novelist, it doesn't apply. There's no answer which applies across the board, you know, because novelists are of very, very different kinds. Some feel the need to have a kind of public art, you know, an art that engages with public life. And others don't, they just don't want to, you know, and I think both kinds of novels can be great. So I'm reluctant ever to say, here is what writers should do, you know, but I think what literature does do at its best is to provide a world for people to live in while they're reading the book, which is first of all interesting in itself, enjoyable in itself, and secondly, makes the reader think about human nature, understand things about how we are with each other and what we do to each other, and to come out of that world with perhaps a slightly enhanced sense of what it is to live in this world, you know. And I think that's what writing does at its best. And I think, see, one of the things I think is a kind of magical thing about literature as opposed to film or music or whatever, is that the other art forms happen outside you. You know, you sit there as an audience, and there's somebody playing a musical instrument over there, or there's a movie on a screen over there, and you watch it. And you can engage with it very deeply. You know, of course you can, and be very deeply affected by it. But it's over there, and you're over here. You know, whereas when you read a book, it's inside your head. You know, and the intimacy of the conversation between the writer and the reader, you know, the conversation that happens inside the reader, you know, is a very profound intimacy, and it's a unique thing to literature. Right? You know, that it can be an interior experience. You know, and so when books affect you, they affect you very profoundly. You know, and I think when the experience of falling in love with a book, you know, of really loving a book, which may not happen that often. You know, it may happen a few times in a lifetime. You know, if you have to name the books, you know, somebody asks you what are the books you really love, that's probably not a long list. You know, it's probably a short list. But those books, I believe, in some way change the way you see the world. You know, that you begin afterwards to see the world a little bit through what you've absorbed from that work of art. You know, so, and I think that's how. I don't believe in this idea that literature can change the world. You know, I think that's kind of overclaiming. Every so often, very rarely, there's a work of literature that has a direct social impact. You know, and one example of that would be Uncle Tom's Cabin. You know, that when that book came out, it had a profound impact on the discussion of slavery in America. And in fact, there's a rather nice story that President Lincoln was introduced to Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and he said to her, "So you're the little woman who started this big war." You know? And you can see the sense in which that's true. You know? But mostly that's not what happens. You know? I mean, and mostly what happens is this other strange thing of every so often this intimate experience between the writer and the reader doing something profound to the reader. And the great thing about it is that neither the author nor the reader can predict when it's going to happen or to whom.
Do you think that's a timeless experience? So no matter what's going on in the world, no matter how history is changing and how people are changing, societies are changing, do you think that's an experience?
Yeah, I think that's what, I mean, this is why this form has hung around so long. You know, it's because our desire to be told stories is very, very central to human nature. You know, I've said often that we are the storytelling animal. You know, we are the only creature on Earth that does this very strange thing of telling itself stories in order to understand what kind of creature it is. You know, some of those stories are true stories, some of them are made-up stories. But we all tell each other stories. I'm not even talking about professional writers. We all tell each other stories about ourselves all the time, and it's a way in which we understand who we are. You know, and I think therefore we are creatures who understand ourselves through narrative. That's the point I'm trying to make. We are more narrative-oriented than analysis-oriented. You know, we learn more through stories than through any other structure, you know, and that's why it persists. You know, it's just something people need. When children are very little, the moment they feel safe and loved and fed and housed, very, very soon after that, the next question is, tell me a story. You know, the desire for once upon a time is very, very, very deep in human beings. And so no matter what else happens, that persists. People still want it. Tell me a story.
I think one thing that strikes me about that is data. So we're a very data-driven company, but data is just another story.
Yeah.
Another set of stories.
No, I think we just organize ourselves through narrative. You know,
Yep.
I think it's natural to us to do it.
Hi, Salman. Massive fan, read all your books, and I guess that's because as someone born in India and growing up in the West, your novels were always able to bring together these really unrelated spheres of my life. And my question for you is quite a general one, really. If you had any thoughts on the future of India, its role in the world, and its relationship with the West?
Well, God.
a nice, easy one to
Yeah,
finish.
in 20 words or less, right? I mean, I think it's a worrying time in India, you know, particularly in the area we're talking about tonight, which has to do with free expression. You know, I think there's a lot of bullying going on, a lot of repression. I mean, there's been 3 people killed in recent weeks for upsetting various extremist groups. Writers included. So it's becoming. This government has allowed a kind of thuggishness to arrive in Indian life, which has never been there to that degree before. Of course, there have been terrible, violent moments in the history of India. It'd be wrong not to say that, but right now, it's very interesting that after these recent murders, including the murder of this Muslim man for having allegedly eaten beef, which it turns out he actually hadn't done. But even if he had, so what? You know, that's not a reason to lynch somebody, except now it is. And since this happened, and since there have been these other murders recently of writers and other anti-government individuals, the Prime Minister of India has said nothing. And Mr. Modi is an incredibly talkative man. He talks all the time about everything, particularly himself. He's a kind of Donald Trump figure, except he's running the country with a very large majority. Very, very powerful, probably the most powerful leader that India's had for quite a long time, because he doesn't require coalitions, he doesn't require compromises. He's there with a mandate, and yet here are these terrible events happening with what seems to be, at the very least, the collusion of members of his party, if not the actual organization of the events by members of his party. We don't quite know that yet, but it seems fairly clear that the BJP people have been involved in all these atrocities, and yet not a word from the Prime Minister's office, which is clearly saying, go ahead. It's clearly enabling, giving permission, unspoken permission, to these very violent elements in the society. So yeah, I'm very worried about it. I'm very worried about it. And whenever people speak up, I mean, right now there's an enormous protest going on in India by writers and intellectuals, many of whom, because the Indian Academy, the Sahitya Academy, has also remained completely silent in the face of actual murders of writers and intellectuals, hasn't said a single thing. And so an enormous number, a growing number, I mean 7 today, of writers and intellectuals are returning honors that they've received from the Academy and protesting against its silence, and immediately they are vilified. Because the thing about the Modi crew, let's say, is that it's enormously skilled at using social media. And I mean, I had a tweet this morning supporting some of the writers who had protested about these things. There have now been maybe 10,000 tweets calling me all sorts of names within a couple of hours of my saying this one thing. And that's happening to everybody who in any way objects to what's going on. There's an orchestrated, very, very extreme attack on them, throughout all media. So yeah, it's a worrying time. I think we're getting to the point where it's difficult to call India a free society. I think they may just have elected Mussolini.
Right, I think we have time for one more very fast question, and then we'll move to books are for sale and a book signing outside. But if we can take one last quick one. Thank you.
This is on a slightly lighter note.
Yes.
Oh, good.
If you can choose, what's your favorite book that you've written?
That I've written?
Yeah, also what's the favorite one that you've read, assuming they're not the same?
Yeah. No, I don't actually read the novels of Salman Rushdie, I just write them. And by the time I've finished writing them, I've read them so many times that I never want to look at them again. So, because in the process of writing a book, you reread and reread and reread, and by the time the book has gone through the publication period, you've read it again in great detail, dozens of times, and at the end of that, I'm done with it. I have to say, I'm really delighted with the way in which this book is being received so far. People seem to be really enjoying it and having a great time with it, and that's a very nice feeling. And there are these 2 earlier books that I wrote for my 2 sons when they were 11 or 12 years old each, Harun and the Sea of Stories and Luca, The Fire of Life, which are, one is a sort of sequel to the other. And I have a very soft spot for those, partly because they were written in this very personal way. And again, partly because I just had the most fun writing them. They were really, I can see why people who write children's books go around looking happy. Because it's kind of fun, and also the response you get from young readers is incredibly enjoyable. I get these letters from entire classrooms, who've been reading Haroon or Luca, and they've all done drawings of the characters, and they write me notes saying which characters they like and which ones they don't like, and giving me tips for how to write sequels, and what that should be about. And I mean, it's really a lot of fun. I had this letter from a girl in America, in Massachusetts, when Haroon came out. And she asked me various questions. She was obviously quite a smart, highly literate reader, so she had quite an intelligent letter. And at the end of it, it said, "Please write back. Please reply to this letter at once." she said, "Because when I grow up, I intend to be either a writer myself or a world leader." I thought, right back to this girl. She's going to be president in 20 years' time. So anyway, those books, I think I would choose, if I had to choose, I'd choose those because it's been so much fun to be their author, because of what's come back at me.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for coming here and talking to us today. This has been an absolutely amazing event.
Thank you.
We're absolutely delighted. Please
Well,
join me.
thank you all for
Thank
coming.
you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.